Serving in God's strength. We are to use the abilities and gifts God has given us diligently, but we are always to rely on His divine strength. Here's Gene.
Going to Exodus chapter 3, we read, and now this is where he's on the backside of the desert. This is now 40 years later. 40 years later. This is history compressed. Meanwhile, Moses was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He was a pagan priest. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God, which is really Mount Sinai. And then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire within a bush. As Moses looked, he saw the bush was on fire, but not consumed. Now, at this point, I think we have to understand that he doesn't even realize who God is. He is still in process of discovering the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But he's in process. And so God says to him when he looked to see the bush, "Therefore go, I am sending you to Pharaoh. Now is the time, Moses. I'm sending you so that you may lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Now you will be the deliverer, but you're not going to be the deliverer with your own right hand. You're going to be the deliverer because you're representing me." But Moses' response is really fascinating. Moses asked God, "Who am I?" Isn't that fascinating? 40 years before, he was saying, "Look at who I am," when he went out to try to deliver the children of Israel. His motives in many respects were right, but his methods were wrong because they were based upon what he thought about himself and his own strength and his own abilities. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? His last remembrance, by the way, of Pharaoh is that Pharaoh was out to kill him. And when the king is out to kill you, that's dangerous territory, to go back to Egypt. And he answered, God said, "I will certainly be with you. I'm not asking you to do something by yourself, Moses. And this will be the sign to you that I've sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will all worship God at this mountain. You're going to come back to this very place." Now, he had no concept of what all that meant. We have the end of the story, so we know what God is talking about in delivering them. Now, here's the fascinating thing. Moses said, "Who am I?" at this moment. But in Acts chapter 7, verse 22, here's what we read. So Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Which means that Moses, at one point in his life, was probably the most intelligent man on the face of the earth. Because Egypt was known as the place of wisdom, of architecture, of mathematics, of art. They had built the pyramids. And it's just taken us almost into this century to figure out how they built those pyramids, how they did that. It is an incredible feat of architectural planning and engineering. And Moses was part of that. So the book of Acts, we read about it. This is Stephen's sermon and message before the Sanhedrin. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He was powerful in his speech. He was an orator. He probably was a professor, a teacher. You know, he had a PhD from the University of Egypt, as it were, being educated there in that court of Pharaoh. Powerful in his speech, powerful in his actions. And now 40 years later, here we have a man on the backside of the desert that has lost his ability to even believe in himself. Who am I? Well, God understands all this, which leads us, obviously, to the next principle. But let me just share with you that the Apostle Paul had the same challenge, because the Apostle Paul was probably one of the most educated Pharisees at the time when he actually took the life of Stephen, at least approved of it. And so look at what he says when he came to the Corinthians. When I came to you, brothers, announcing the testimony of God to you, I did not come with brilliance of speech. Paul was an orator. But when he came with the gospel, he didn't come with confidence and brilliance of speech. Does that mean that he wasn't articulate? No, but he didn't come and rely on brilliance of speech and wisdom, human wisdom. For I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness. You know, I wasn't the guy that I once was, in killing people and putting them in prison. I came in weakness. I actually came in fear and in much trembling at times. This is the Apostle Paul, the one who was putting Christians in prison. My speech and my proclamation were not with persuasive words of wisdom, though I think he was very articulate, that he wasn't relying on just wisdom. And by the way, when he came to Corinth, he had just had the experience on Mars Hill, which was the center of Greek and Roman wisdom. And he had talked to these philosophers, and he didn't get much response in talking to these guys. And he leaves there and he goes to Corinth. And I think in some respects, he learned a lesson on Mars Hill. You know, I can't rely on human wisdom, on the philosophy of Greece and Rome, but on the simple gospel of Jesus Christ. And a demonstration of the Spirit and power so that your faith might not be based on men's wisdom, but on God's power. And so you see the Apostle Paul having to go through the same experience, as it were, that Moses went through so many centuries before. And so the question is, how can we use our intellectual strengths and our physical abilities, emotional strength as well, to the full, and yet rely on God's divine guidance and strength? In no way does the Bible teach that we are to lay aside all of our abilities, all of our skills, all that we know. That's not what the Scriptures is teaching. What it's teaching is we shouldn't rely on it. We shouldn't substitute that for God's power and humility and the wisdom. 1 Corinthians Principle 5. When presenting God's truth, we should not depend, that's the key word, upon our eloquence, upon our personal strength, but on God's presence and power. Use all the gifts God has given us, but in the process, relying upon God. And again, that's just a process of balance and seeking God's help in order to maintain that balance.